evening. The news gang is here. Tonight, no touchdown for lockdown just yet. Uhuru's irreducible minimum. Also, is the government playing Russian roulette with Sputnik vaccine, or are we just not getting it? Plus, no shakedown in the handshake, or is there? The return of Baba, and did he say the president drove to his house, woke him up and picked him up for the city tour? Oh well. When I grow up. On the memo, Jamila celebrates political responsibility in Kisumu. Yvonne's take is on the road to Damascus with quite a few politicians. Gashuri invokes the standing orders of parliament to punch holes into a fake news item. And the angle is an Easter sermon on that national hashtag, crucify him. Linus is off tonight, while our sign language gangster here in studio is Wilson Mushara.
Kutoa shukrani sana kwa ndugu yangu Rais Uhuru Kenyatta ambaye amekuja akanitoa kwa kitanda akaniambia nitoke. Vile hii mnajua kwa wiki 3 sasa nimekuwa mimi naugua ugonjwa wa corona na nimekaa nyumbani kwa wiki 2. Wiki moja nilikuwa hapo Nairobi Hospital. Lakini sasa mara 2 mfululizo madaktari wamekuja wakanipima na zote zikatoka ati COVID negative. Kwa hivyo wamenitoa na mimi nikasema nitatoka ili niende nje niweze kuonana na wananchi wanione ana kwa ana ya kwamba mimi niko sawa sasa.
All right, Francis, let me start with you. I mean, hata wewe kuna wakati uliambiwa, I know you, Francis, but I don't think he has woken you up and picked you up to any location.
Yeah.
But that was quite an interesting development. I mean, just a couple of days ago, a lot of people have been asking, where is Raila Odinga? What is going on? The handshake seems to be unraveling. BBI is up in the air. And then suddenly this morning, the president coming out with him to inspect a few projects in town, and all the way up to Kajiado, by the way. And then there they are. I actually noted that they used my brother Ndugu yangu almost 100 times during that entire journey. Significant.
Absolutely. And for what we saw today, it is less of what was said, but more of what we saw.
Optics.
It was for optics. For optics for three reasons, I would say. Number one, there has been some disquiet about the handshake. Number two, there have been some jitters about BBI. And number three, since ODM leader Raila Odinga was confirmed to have COVID, the coronavirus, it was important for him to come out and show his supporters that here I am, because there were concerns about his state of health. So those 3 things were, in my opinion, the most significant things that happened today. Let me go back to the handshake and the BBI question. In the last, let's say, 3 weeks or so, starting from that salvo that was fired by James Orengo, the Siaya senator, alongside Otiende Amolo, there were concerns about the state of the handshake. And when the One Kenya Alliance team started coming out, there was a feeling that the ODM leader was being relegated to the periphery. You saw, heard, read talk of the former Prime Minister Anachezwa is being played. And so those concerns that were raised today was an answer to that question. Has he been played? Is he together with the president? Is the handshake still intact? That was the answer that was being given today. Number two, there were specific timelines that were given in November last year about the BBI process, right from collection of signatures, verification by IEBC, submission to the county assemblies, submission to parliament. And there's a place at which it almost stalled, and that is at the parliamentary level. By the 4th of April, that document was supposed to have been either approved or rejected by the Senate and the National Assembly. The two houses have adjourned until next month, for about a month. And so there were questions. Is the BBI on the right track? Has it stalled? Has COVID stopped reggae? Those are some of the questions that were being raised. So the long and short of it is that today it was for optics to try and answer all those questions that people were raising in relation to the state of the handshake and the health status of the BBI.
Politics is fed on imagery, Joe, and what Kashri just said, it feeds on what people see. It feeds on, not really based on what they hear, usually it's what they see. And Raila Odinga and the president have not been able to be seen together in one place for various reasons, one being the former prime minister's health, and two, the restrictions put in place because of COVID-19, no political rallies and all that. So they've not been seen together, and then all this disquiet had come up. Again, I've said politics is fed by optics, so it wasn't even what was said. Remember, the BBI was not mentioned at all in this whole tour, and in the press conference that came afterwards, they talked about the restrictions, they talked about the former prime minister's health, and I want to give a small example of what the importance of optics is. There was once a king who had a butler who had worked very closely with him for a long time. He was very loyal, and he asked, so what do you want me to give you as a gift? So the butler said, whenever you're in your next baraza or public meeting, call me to whisper something in your ear. And call me a second time to whisper something in your ear. And promise me you'll not tell anyone what you've said to me. And the king asked, is that all you want? Yes, that's all I want. So during the next public baraza, when the king was in the middle of speaking, the guy was standing strategically somewhere, called him, whispered something. As he was walking away, he called him back and whispered something again. Just that imagery, what people saw, made this guy one of the most powerful people in the land, because he said he literally has the king's ear. So it's what people saw, not what they heard. That's one. And two, I think what we saw today was also, I think, to keep the political agenda alive. Basically, the political agenda has been a bit mysterious, not really clear what the political agenda is. The BBI seems to be the face of it. And I think what the lieutenant saw today was something, okay, tunaweza kuambia watu sasa kwamba BBI bado iko, because the past few weeks were like, iki tu iko ama hakuna, tutaambia watu nini. So this was also very important for the lieutenants to see. And finally, they were responding to claims that their relationship was shaky, that kuna nyufa katika handshake, katika uhusiano wao. Ndugu, tuko pamoja, the respect, the camaraderie. Yes, what we saw. I think this is what they were trying to show, and I think to some extent it may have worked.
And I'll come to you, Yvonne, in a moment, but your Butler story, you know, it reminded me in 2002, an incident that I've never forgotten. So all these, they call them secret tea meetings that politicians like to have, and in the next couple of months we'll be seeing a lot of them where, you know, you suddenly hear this politician and the other were meeting. So it happened to be a meeting between Mwai Kibaki and Simeon Nyachai. Simeon Nyachai then of Ford People, and Mwai Kibaki was leading the NAK, which later merged with LDP to form NAC. And so so we were sticking out as journalists, and wherever I actually happened to be the only journalist at that particular time. Well, there weren't so many TVs at the time. But anyway, what happened is that as the two gentlemen were walking out. In fact, Kibaki walked out first. So as he was walking at the door like this, a certain gentleman who I will not mention, but who had many dealings with the Kanu government at the time, also happened to be walking into the Serena Hotel, and then they meet at the door and they shake hands, and we are there with all our cameras and everything. And so after this, I remember that gentleman frantically looking for me and said, please don't show that picture and everything. Because that was very big those days. Like, how could you be seen with that guy? What were you doing with that person? And surprise, surprise, a few months down the road when Kibaki was now president, he has been sworn in at Uhuru Park. A few days after that, this same person now calls me, you know, and says, ile picha ulipiga siku ile iko, you know, because now that thing would really be useful. I mean, I referred the guy to a library. I hope he got the picture. But the point is that politicians love that, and it was very common during the imagery thing was very common during the Moi regime. You go to certain offices and you find somebody has a picture with Mzee behind there, and then that somebody is very powerful. Just because of that, they would, you know, invite some contractor or something into their office, and when they see that, they don't even need to say, no, Mzee is my friend, but just the picture alone. Very interesting. But Yvonne, what did that speak to you? Do you think anything has moved at all in terms of the confusion that we've been experiencing, rather witnessing as a country, around the relationship between these two gentlemen and everything surrounding BBI and the whole handshake story?
I don't I don't think so, but it puts a pause, you know, with all of the stories and all of the innuendo. And it also, I guess, significantly, like Jamila said, you know, they didn't discuss BBI today, but it was a show of confidence with the president sitting right next to the former prime minister, almost as if that's his deputy, yeah? Or his right-hand man in government. And here they are inspecting these government projects together. And, you know, there's been a bit of disquiet or rumor and innuendo that the president himself would back a Raila presidency, but perhaps the people around him not necessarily so. And so this was to tell the world, at least from the president's personal perspective, that I still have confidence in him. From what Orengo was saying the other day, that there are some, you know, government and state operatives around the president who are trying to steer things in one direction. So it was him maybe trying to say, well, maybe the deep state, as it were, might not want a Raila presidency, but I, as Uhuru Kenyatta, do support him. And it was also very interesting that it comes really on the day when Raila Odinga has finally submitted his papers to his party as one of the presidential candidates. If you recall, the timeline or the deadline for that lapsed, and his name was not there. He had not submitted, you know, his papers or his request to be there. And so all of these things then happening on exactly the same day, you know, is to say, you know, that I'm still here. However, the big issues, the big elephants in the room, you know, still persist. The One Kenya Alliance is still there going strong for whatever it's worth, you know, depending on which analysts will tell you, is it something worth speaking of or isn't it? And then with whatever is happening with BBI in Parliament, whatever is happening with BBI in court, there is still a lot of issues that stand in the way of, you know, the BBI process. But this was just, you know, one of those moments to pause. I mean, I think, you know, they were even having similar shirts. A lot of this was reminiscent. And then it also came for me on the back of last week, was it on Friday, when we saw the president and members of cabinet and other arms of government receiving the vaccine, and his principal assistant, the deputy president, was conspicuously absent. Now, for the former prime minister, you would say, you know, he had COVID, he's recovering from it, he has to wait. We don't see the deputy president at State House, but then we see him days later taking, you know, a vaccine that some say is, you know, fairly different from, you know, Oxford AstraZeneca. That hasn't been confirmed or denied yet, you know, by his people. But for me, it was just the whole, that thing happening together with the papers and with the president himself giving, you know, a show of confidence. But when you look at them, you know, those are two of, it would look like a president and his deputy inspecting the work of their government, you know, that I found really interesting.
Interesting, but Francis, interesting the number of times they said, my brother, ndugu yangu, and all of that. There clearly is a message that subliminally, at least, they were trying to portray, even though they didn't talk about BBI, even though they didn't talk about a handshake and all of these things. But this idea of bringing Kenyans together, both of them said, well, ndugu yangu sasa amepona, tutaendelea na kazi ya kuleta wa Kenya pamoja. And I think the former Prime Minister also saying the same things in not too dissimilar terms, essentially saying that, you know, this whole idea of bringing the country together has been some code word or code phrase for BBI, for handshake.
Absolutely. And once again, it is not in so much what they said than what they didn't say. And they left us to look at what they were doing, how they were, you know, relating to each other. And that use of the word ndugu yangu, my brother, it shows closeness. It shows guys who are in touch. And you see, the state of the handshake, whether there are problems in the handshake or there aren't any problems in the handshake, you will rarely hear the president and the ODM leader talk about them. Every so often you'll hear those close to them point you to certain challenges in the handshake. But I look at it this way. The two people who know exactly what is contained in the handshake or what it is all about or was all about, the president and the ODM leader. Yeah. So every so often when you hear their lieutenants speak and say there are problems, they will come out and, you know, try and deal with all those questions. But truth be told, there are concerns, there are issues that have been raised. But when you see the two, it's basically trying to deal with the concerns that have been raised by their lieutenants. Number one. Number two, look at a meeting that was held yesterday by the ODM team, some top leaders in ODM. And you see a realization that last year and the year before, when 2 years before when the handshake came up, it would have been too early at that time to start talking about 2022. But here we are, less than a year and a half to the general election. So on one hand, ODM, like all other parties that are interested in the presidency, will also start preparing. And that's what you see, they're preparing. And so the preparation is side by side with the BBI process. Today, you saw 3 candidates or 3 aspirants for the ODM ticket. Joho, Hassan Joho, the governor from Mombasa, Wycliffe Oparanya, the governor of Kakamega, and now Raila Odinga, the ODM leader. Is there a possibility that Oparanya and Joho can beat Raila Odinga in the nomination process for the ODM flag, to be the ODM flag bearer? I highly doubt. Highly doubt. So this was also a confirmation from that statement sent by Catherine Muma, the chair of the electoral body of ODM, that Raila Odinga is in the race for the 5th time in his political career. And so that statement, coinciding with today's tour, shows you that other than BBI, there's also another important race ahead, the presidential race. And look at also what has been happening. There's the One Kenya Alliance on one hand. They haven't told us who is their presidential candidate, but there's talk of that team, who is likely to be their candidate and who is backing them. Yeah. On the other hand, there's the deputy president with his team. They have declared, he has declared he wants to be president. And so every day you will see people who want to be president coming out, even though not openly stating that I'm in the race, but they'll give you indicators that they are in the race. Like that statement today from the ODM Elections Board is a confirmation that as is now, Raila Odinga is in the race. So what we saw today is not so much about the development projects, the inspection and everything else. Those are political statements that were being sent.
And I just wanted to add, you know, when we're talking about optics, so notice one thing, they humanize themselves by walking on the streets and, you know, they're walking together. I mean, they literally just fell short of holding hands, you know, which is something that is highly discouraged now during COVID-19. Look at the way they were casually dressed, you know, trying to look like, you know, we're easy. These are 2, you know, good friends who are taking a walk in the streets and,
like who is that saying there's trouble?
Who is that saying there's trouble? I mean, look at us. You know, we're dressed, you know, not so formally, you know, in those shirts with a hat and whatnot, untucked. You know, these are easy friends who are taking a stroll, you know, down the street. The not so formal language all the time, you know, the constant references to personal things like, oh, you know, he came, he woke me up, and now, you know, I'm happy that my brother is here and now we can carry on with the work of uniting the nation. All of these things were,
almost like the country had been closed and disbanded, like the other guys said.
And now that we hadn't seen the 2 of them together in, you know, at least 2 or 3 weeks, that the country was, you know, deeply divided. Yes. But you could see that's what they were trying to portray.
And I think something that, sorry Joe, something that the president said when they were speaking at State House was, he said how now Raila ameshapona, sasa tunaweza kuendelea na kazi yetu.
Exactly.
Yeah, we can continue with what we were doing. I think that's maybe the only indication we got that pengine ni BBI ilikuwa inatajwa. But I think something else we need to look at when you're talking about the ODM politics is the meeting that happened, I think yesterday, between the Raila Odinga and ODM party leaders, including Sifuna and Gladys Wanga and Junaid Mohammed and John Badi. And then now, of course, the statement that came out afterwards, of course, they're trying to allay fear. I think they're just trying to say chama iko, tuko imara and all that. I think basically also because of what had been said by members of parliament and senators about the BBI in the past few days. I think
and
before
governors,
we continue, and governors
including
also.
the deputy party leader.
Yes, Wycliffe Oparanya, who's said he's running for president on the ODM ticket. I think we can listen to the sound bites on MPs on BBI delays as we continue with the discussion.
We are therefore asking for more time to comprehensively consider the bill. I counted the number of lawyers in the Senate
in the National Assembly in these two committees. Cumulatively, the lawyers in these two committees have got 250 years of practice. Cumulative, 250 years. Which other lawyer in Kenya do we need more than 250 years to do this for us?
In fact, it is almost getting to a position where we may request the committee to be dissolved, Mr. Speaker.
The discussion out there today in the media is whether there is disagreement between Jubilee and ODM, between Handshake partners, yet it is these members who have issues.
Why do they want an extension? Is there a problem in the committee? What are the reasons?
I think what we saw today was try to answer some of those questions that had come up.
And Jamila, one thing I think that perhaps is lost in all of these things is the whole question of timing. If you think about, if you're Uhuru Kenyatta, the president of this country, you're thinking about BBI. BBI is something that the president has put front and center. He believes, and that is what he has said many times, that this is something that is going to cement his legacy in many ways, in terms of, as he puts it, uniting the country and all that. But beyond that, there is all the question of his own political base. How is he leaving it? Because he's going to leave power in another year or so, according to the constitution. So how is he leaving that base? And the whole question of new constituencies that people have been asking him for. So there's a sense in which he has so much sticked on to this BBI, and yet in a very interesting way, right now the life of BBI is in very large measure dependent on this camaraderie that you talk about. The handshake literally has to hold for BBI to go anywhere. And therefore, if there was ever going to be, because political agreements in this country crumble all the time, so if that were to happen, then it cannot be allowed to happen before BBI is passed. And so for the president, time is of the essence in terms of making up or clearing any doubts that existed that perhaps this whole BBI thing is actually going the route that many political alliances in this country have gone. So the president, on his part, needed to ensure that he came out, needed to ensure that he appears with the former prime minister, and to project that image that, you know what, this BBI thing is still on track, and to also assure the supporters of Raila Odinga that, you know, what are all these things that people have been saying? It's just this gentleman was unwell and so we couldn't meet, but here we are still good, we are still the same brothers that we used to be. That is very important. For Raila Odinga, again, that was just as important, because he has also been, even though he's been down, he's been facing a bit of pressure from his electorate. I mean, we listen to people, for example, from different bases of ODM, and there is a sense, has been at least before this one, I don't know whether that has changed a lot, but before this certainly there was a sense that finally it is happening. This is what we have feared would happen, that the president would move on to other alliances, and that the ODM leader would be betrayed. That's the word that we use. So both of them were in this space where they needed to make a political point to their political basis, so that this BBI project is pushed forward, so that the bases still have faith in BBI, because without the handshake, as I said, BBI basically is dead on arrival. And so the timing question was paramount even in what we saw today.
But beyond the politics, you know, and while the optics today was really important for them to say that BBI is on course, there are some serious threats to the timelines, you know, that they have been so confident about. If we recall, Junaid Mohammed said, you know, we will have a referendum before June. The political camaraderie aside, the handshake aside, two things stand in the way of a referendum. One, the COVID-19. We're now, you know, in the third wave. There's some tight restrictions on at least 5 counties and across the country. How are you going to, one, popularize, you know, this agenda in a country where you're restricting movement and large gatherings? How are you going to conduct an election where people will naturally need to be crowding in one place that is, i.e. queuing, to go and take a vote. And remember, we're in a third wave. There's already reports of a fourth wave in places like the United States. And if you recall, Africa is usually slightly behind that curve. So who's to say whether that is coming? And with all of these restrictions in place. Are we able to conduct a referendum during a third wave or a fourth wave or whatever that is? That's to be decided. But then there's also the other big thing, and that is the courts. So if you remember those seven cases that were collapsed into one, what was the first injunction that was placed? It was on the IBC.
Don't prepare for a referendum.
Do not prepare for a referendum. So right now, all of the processes that the IBC would actually be beginning to prepare, in all likelihood of an anticipated referendum, which was a done deal basically, would be funds, budgeting, printing ballot papers, logistics, in fact hiring returning officers and many other staff that would need, checking their systems that those are okay. The IBC is not doing any of that right now. So even if by some miracle the court was to rule in favor of the BBI, it would still take IBC some time to first of all gather the resources which would have to be approved by Parliament, disbursed in what would be a supplementary budget, and then they would begin the preparations. That's not likely to happen before June. But in the event that, say, this goes through the courts, there's also another injunction that was passed, was it last week? Where Parliament, even if Parliament passes the bill and the President assents to the bill without a referendum, then there is that conservatory orders that were put in place, which were that the court issued conservatory orders suspending the coming into force of the constitutional amendment bill coming from Parliament, that will be passed by Parliament from coming into force.
Yeah. So it's essentially that process between Parliament and the President's assent. That is what's been frozen.
Which would then kick off the referendum. So again, there is another injunction. And by the way, all of the parties in that case have made their submissions. They're now waiting for the court to rule. And from what I'm told, the judgment will be delivered on notice. The earliest this can happen, would be June. So there's highly unlikely for one to happen between now and then. So even if you talk about, a handshake and the politics of it, there are some other bigger threats to a possible referendum before
Gashuri
June,
had come up with an October date, I remember, during the
we need to take a break, and then we can come and finish this one. Yeah,
so that we're in line with the timelines here.
Very, very important. We can't be breaking BBI timelines and on the show as well. Anyway, News Gang is taking a short break. We'll be right back with that discussion that we are beginning to conclude here, but we'll also be talking about the vaccines and the President's orders, lockdown, and all the related stories.